it couldn't have equality of opportunity, really, if it was also going to just produce people who would be willing to fit in to a system in which the rewards are unfairly distributed. But it could, and did, prepare people for adult work roles. And it's because the third one trumped the first two that the school system has failed so miserably in these very elevated objectives. And I thought that then, and I think that now. I thought that then because of the evidence which we then collected. And is your name Mindy? Did you ask about the correspondence principle? Yeah. We developed this fancy name, the correspondence principle, because we were curious about how it is that schools prepare people for these adult roles. And by the way, we didn't think it was the curriculum or, the Pledge of Allegiance or anything like that. We thought it was basically something which was much more sociological, and it's something which I learned in Nigeria as a teacher. I was curious as to why people who ran warehouses or trucking firms and stuff like that, they were paying a very high premium to get people with primary school education compared to people without a primary school education. And where I lived, there were very few primary schools. I mean, there was a province of 2 million people, and there was only one secondary school. So education was rare, and the people who got a little bit of education were getting paid a lot more. And I interviewed lots of people for my dissertation to try to find out why. And it had nothing to do with the fact that they were illiterate. It had everything to do with the fact that they had learned how to sit in one place and do something extremely boring for a long period of time under the authority of somebody who wasn't their dad or wasn't a member of their traditional culture. In other words, they'd learned to fit into a modern economy. And that was basically something what schools did for you. There was somebody up there at the head of the room, and in those schools, he surely wasn't a family member, almost certainly wasn't from your town. In a few cases, wasn't even of your religion, because there were some teachers there who were Christians, some who were nothing, but not all the teachers were Islamic in that area, though all the kids were. So that's what they were being taught. Now, we tried to investigate if that was happening in America. And we thought, well, sure, it seems to be happening. And I'll tell you one study we did because it's so cool. I mean, I say cool, it sounds immodest. It was just incredible luck that it worked out. But here's what we did. We were interested in, well, okay, the schools are preparing, quote, good workers. What's a good worker? Well, we went to a couple of workplaces, and many workplaces, you can go to the supervisors and you get the rankings of the people because they are forced to, by their handbook, actually have rankings of people for, who's up next for promotion and so on. So we got all the supervisor rankings, and then we took a group of people who were working together, like for a group of this size might be working together in some office or something, and we did a peer ranked personality test. So, for example, we had about 8 adjectives like perseverant, creative, independent, aggressive, and so on. And we asked each person in the group to put a name of a person in their group next to those adjectives, whichever one fit best. They had to put 3 names next to perseverant, and 3 names next to punctual, and 3 names next to creative and independent, and so on. And then we did the obvious, which is we then correlated those personality traits with the rankings. The results were astounding. Things like perseverant and punctual were extraordinarily highly, that is, the correlation between being perseverant or punctual was extremely highly, it was very highly correlated with the rankings by the supervisors. Creative and independent were very strongly negatively correlated with the rankings of the supervisors. And anybody who supervised a bunch of people doing boring things will understand why that's true. So the obvious next step was to go to schools. So we then went to schools, and we looked at grades. And we did the same peer personality ranking thing, and we did grades. But in this case, we could do something even better. So suppose we have math grades. And then we do a linear regression. We predict math grades on the basis of a math achievement score, and then these personality rankings. So this is pretty strong, right? We're saying, given how much you know according to the test, how's your grade, and does it correlate with your personality characteristics? And we got exactly the same result. I mean, if I showed you those 2 bar graphs, you would think you were looking at the same bar graph. Very negative on independence and creativity, strongly positive on perseverance and punctual, and so on. That's where the correspondence principle came from. So we said, the way that people are trained to fit into these adult work roles is by subjecting them at a young age to a system of rewards which exactly replicates the kind of work rewards they're going to find in the workplace. Now, of course, an obvious question is, well, how did that come about? I mean, the schools that we were studying were in New York, and the labor markets that we studied were in Boston. So, I mean, there was no connection between those two studies. How does it come about? I'll come back to that. But so our idea was that somehow schools are producing a person to fit into these work roles. And unfortunately, the work roles don't demand very much of cognitive skill. They demand a lot of behavioral skills. Now, this was, of course, regarded with some suspicion, or at least I think people thought it was a kind of an odd interpretation of what the schools were doing, because at that time, but not now, at that time, the so-called theory of human capital was interpreted as a matter of skill. Human capital, and then we go to school, you get some skills, that's why you make more money afterwards. And what we were saying is, no, it doesn't have much to do with skill at all. It certainly doesn't have much to do with cognitive skills, or at least not those skills that are measured on tests. And we showed that rather definitively. Now, what's happened in the intervening years is rather amazing, because I think everybody here knows that the University of Chicago is the opposite of the UMass economics department. I mean, it's the far right of the American economic profession. And in recent years, well, there's a new edition of Schooling in Capitalist America coming out. And to our great surprise, on the back of the book will be an endorsement of the book by a professor from the University of Chicago, Nobel Prize winner James Heckman. And Heckman, those of you who study statistics, you've heard of the Heckman correction and so on. He's a very nerdy econometrician, but he was absolutely persuaded that we were right, that it was basically behavioral skills, or soft skills as he calls them, and not cognitive skills that account for education doing its job. Now, we did some similar work on inequality, showing the ways in which the school system essentially legitimated rather than eroded inequalities. That also has been, I'm happy to say, very strongly vindicated by research much better than ours, partly because much better data is available, and partly because econometrics has moved way forward in the last 20, 30 years, and modern methods are just much better. So I think the message of the book, that is, if you want a school system to fit into a hierarchically ordered economy which makes limited demands on the cognitive skills of 80% of its workers because of the concentration of decision-making power at the top, if that's what you got a very hard job for schooling, because of the thing that Verity mentioned, which is if you produce people along the lines of the free-thinking, creative people who are committed to being fairly treated, you're producing misfits. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I didn't score very high on the, quote, citizenship part of my report card. That's what we called it in East River, Connecticut. Citizenship. I was okay in subjects, but I wasn't good at behavior. So, I mean, okay. I mean, that's it's a very serious problem. But let's look at that historically. Yes, of course, there are times when the school system does quite the opposite. It doesn't prepare people for the adult work roles. It prepares people to challenge the adult roles. And when something else is going on, then education can have a major role, as it has throughout the world, in actually changing things. And if you look at nationalist movements, whether ordinary nationalist movements or leftist nationalist movements, the role of educated people in those movements has been extraordinary. Or if you look at, if you look in Europe, 19th century, 18th century Europe, but mostly 19th century, from about the middle of the century on, village school teachers were a very important modernizing element, often in contest with the church. And now, they succeeded because they were essentially going with the current. That is, the current of modernization was propelling the whole society forward, and they were part of the agents of that. Now, interestingly, Gintis and I were ourselves an example. After all, we were highly educated, and we were thoroughly deviant. I mean, I'm the only person you know who was fired twice by Harvard. I'm proud of that. Twice. I got fired twice by the same institution. That's good, right? So I was not trained right, despite my teacher's best hopes. And we wrote a chapter on higher education and how higher education in the 60s and early 70s was exactly an example of a situation in which you were producing people who were challenging rather than fitting in. Now, I think that doesn't, I mean, are there cases in which schooling per se can be the leading element in this? Not something which is essentially hitchhiking on another movement stronger than itself. I don't know. I'm interested to think about situations in which schooling itself was the thing that was doing the pushing, as opposed to, in the case of the unification of France or Italy or the other nationalist movements, there's something else going on in schools who are playing an important positive role. Let me address myself to a couple of the other questions that were asked. I want to talk to Tunde about your question about altruistic behavior. My recent work has been about altruism, and the one-liner is that I'm convinced from a very large number of experiments and also observation of history and ethnographies and so on, that altruistic motives are far from being absent, as most biologists and economists assume, are in fact quite prevalent among humans. And I think anthropologists and sociologists have thought this for a long time. Economists have definitely been opposed to this, but it's interesting that the moving and shaking in this field in the last 10 years has come entirely from economics, and it's come from economics experiments, which have shown very clearly that people are willing to pay a lot of money, give up a lot of money to be treated fairly. They're willing to be generous towards others, and they really are very committed not only to helping others, but also to justice. I could explain to you how the experiments show this and so on, but I'm not sure that would be the best use of our time. Now, that makes a big difference. I mean, if you really think that those motives are common in society, then, of course, there are some interesting questions. How could a species have evolved to be so altruistic? Because we would think that, biologists would think that natural selection should have eliminated those people. And Gintis and I have just finished a book. I mean, literally, we just last week sent it into production. It's called A Cooperative Species. And the word cooperation and species are juxtaposed in the title so as to shock either the leftists who don't like the word species because they hate sociobiology, or the rightists who don't like the word cooperation because they think that humans are naturally competitive. We're essentially saying that we think there's a biological argument why humans turned out to be as altruistic as we are. It's a game changer in terms of public policy and educational policy, because if you think that your job as a teacher or as an administrator or as a person writing a tax code or a criminal code is to try to figure out a way to make selfish people act in the public interest, then you'll have a certain agenda. If your task is to write a tax code so that a mixed population in which you have some saints and some sinners and you have people who can shift back and forth under the circumstances, it's a harder problem, but also you have some possibilities which you wouldn't otherwise have. Because you can often count on the civic-minded people to essentially help you by, for example, shaming the people who are the slackers and the free riders and so on. You don't have this problem of essentially designing, as David Hume put it, a constitution for knaves who have no interest but their own. In fact, we should think about policy, including schooling, as we've got a heterogeneous population. Human beings are incredibly we're incredibly versatile in the kinds of motives we bring to bear, all of us sometimes acting selfishly. And I'm sure all of us sometimes acting generously. So it's slightly, we're not trying to mobilize selfish people to act like they were generous. We're trying to mobilize a whole population of mixed people to act in such a way that generosity wins out some of the time when it's necessary. So that's, I mean, I think that those are very important things, and we're just beginning to figure out how you would actually organize things differently if you really believed that not everyone is selfish. Now notice, I'm not saying everybody's altruistic. I'm saying we've got a heterogeneous population and we each can switch also.